Hi, my name is Cynthia Luna, and I wanted to share with you something that I think I might have stumbled on. And so I prepared this quick presentation. It's intended for editors as well as authors. And I'm calling it Edit Your First Novel in 6 to 7 Weeks, a strategic approach to avoid overwhelm. I participated in a contest and it was directed solely to new authors with little to no self publishing experience. And I like to say it was a little bit like, or the design was a little bit like Dancing with the Stars. But the idea was basically that each editor was going to pair up with an author to work on their manuscript, their first self-published novel, or if it's not their first, maybe their second. I think there was a limit to the number of novels that they could have already published. So as you can see, there were 7 weeks to get the manuscript edited and ready for submission. So I stumbled on this method basically due to the demands of this contest. With only 7 weeks to edit, I knew that my usual approach to editing was probably not going to work. Usually what I would do is I would take somebody's full manuscript, I would write down a bunch of notes, scribble comments in the margins, highlight text, all sorts of things. And I would sort of provide one long document to the author, maybe have a phone conversation or a Skype conversation or two, and then say, okay, well, if you do all of these things, you'll already take your manuscript to the next level. I think I've only had one experience where a new author came back to me with all of her changes in about a week. Everybody else sort of took maybe about a month on average. One person took about 7 months before coming back to me with their changes and then, sort of taking their editing to the next level. So I always sort of suspected that there was a little bit of an issue with the editing process, and a lot of things could affect this. It could be that they're having an issue with their own writing and they can't figure out how to solve these problems, or it could also just be life takes over and distracts them from their project. And so, because of the time constraints of this contest, I knew that I wouldn't have that sort of flexibility, and I didn't want my author to disappear for 7 months. So I kind of came up with this strategy or this process, and it involved these 3 overarching steps. So mainly, what I always do whenever I start anything new is I kind of take inventory of what I'm dealing with, and I'll get into a little bit more detail in the next couple slides. I also outline the manuscript's needs. That's no different from what I think most editors do. They write their document, they write their notes, and then they share that with their author. And then in this case, I created the approach. And the approach actually, I'll spoiler alert, tell you right away, it really involved working simultaneously on the document. So the first step, taking inventory. Basically, the editor, that would be me, I read the entire full. And the faster the editor can do this, the better, and especially in this case. So I basically I really did a fast read through, not nearly as carefully as I normally would because of the time constraints. So I think I spent about 4 days reading the full in its entirety. And the idea was that I wanted to suss out the strengths and weaknesses, and also any opportunities or threats. I wanted to see if there were any serious issues that we would have to address at the very beginning. A lot of times the weaknesses are developmental and structural in nature. The character isn't fully developed or hasn't really sort of gone through the transformation that they need to go through. Or sometimes it could be that the mystery wasn't really fully solved. So those are the kinds of things that I was looking for. But again, I was trying to go through this as quickly as possible and just kind of suss out the main issues and challenges that we would be addressing. So part of this take inventory approach involved obviously conferring with the author. So at this point, I'm already kind of shaping a strategy. But I'm also doing another SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, while talking to my author. How open is he going to be with high-level changes, low-level changes? How ready is he for the kinds of developmental or structural changes that we're talking about? So I talked to him about some of the high level and low level typos or recurring crutch words, things like that, from the get-go. Then, of course, I also wanted to talk to him about the technologies that we were going to be using. I'm not sure that my author was fully aware of Google Drive, which was one of the technologies I decided we would use. So we kind of hung out, and over Skype we played with Google Drive a little bit so he could see that we could actually track changes and do certain things at the same time in the document if we actually would end up in the document at the same time. And actually we did end up in the document at the same time a few times. Obviously, we wanted to talk about time constraints and our ability to commit a certain amount of time. In my case, I was lucky. He described himself as a retired empty nester. So I really could, he said I could, count on him for 140 something hours a week. And I was like, well, please don't count on me for 140 hours a week. So, but those are the kinds of things that you really want to get a handle on, how much time this person's going to be able to work on this. And that will obviously also factor into your strategic plan or your process. And then obviously the usual things that you talk to your author with, which are like expectations, their desires and hopes, what they think their major issues are, and what you think their major issues are as far as the manuscript is concerned, and whether they'll be able to sort of address those issues within a certain amount of time. So the usual things that you would talk to your author clients about. Also, as far as expectation, desires, and hopes, I was lucky because my author also said he felt like he had already won the contest. So we were able to just focus on doing the work and not so much on winning the contest. And in a way, I think that is an important distinction to make, because we're really focused on making his book the best book it can be, as opposed to winning a contest and doing everything that it takes to win, as opposed to doing everything that it takes for you to have a winning book. And so I think it took a lot of pressure off of both of us to not think about the judges per se and to really focus on the story. And I think it also added a level of pleasure or enjoyment with the book, so that we could approach it that way. So the next step is that I talked about with this process was outlining the editing strategy. And this is probably the big spoiler alert. We were going to edit and rewrite the manuscript simultaneously using Google Docs. So we focused on content, timing and calendar, execution. So there was some independent editing going on, even if we were simultaneously in the same document. We were working independently of each other. So I might have been working on some of the beginning parts while he was working on an end part. But we also did some watch me work stuff. So we would both be in the document together. And one of the places where that's really, I think we really noticed how we were collaborative was when we worked on the blurb together. But yeah, it was simultaneous editing. That was basically our strategy. So some of the key documents that we had for this, like I said, we opened up a folder in Google Drive. And the folder, basically, we opened up a folder and we included a number of documents, but obviously the main document was the full manuscript. We also included a chapter by chapter outline. Actually, I had the author do this at the very beginning, based on our first phone call. And basically, he just wrote down each of the chapter numbers, plus I think he had them titled as well, so they're chapter titles. And then he might write 1 or 2 sentences about what happened in that chapter. And then we also included a to-do list, what he would do, what I would do. And actually, there was more of what he would do in there than what I would do. We also had a themes brainstorm document and a title brainstorm document. Actually, as it turned out, my author already had a title document brainstorm, a title brainstorm document in his files. So I think he just managed to add that. But it was a very useful tool to use. Okay, let's look at our editing approach. So now I'm going to give you sort of our week by week breakdown. And I'm going to give you another spoiler alert. It actually only took us about 5 weeks. And I would say like the first 3 weeks were, or the first 2 weeks were really intense for me as an editor. I'm sure they were also intense for the author as well. But they were intense for me as an editor because I was explaining some of the needs and the principles of looking at your document as an editor rather than as, I guess, a drafter or a creator. So I'm just going to go through a quick rundown, but you're already reading them, I'm sure. I read the full manuscript. I entered loose notes in the chapter by chapter outline. The kind of notes that I included in this chapter by chapter outline was basically like this chapter flags or this conversation between the main character and her mother is flags. I also made a note of what the point of the chapter was. That actually was my guiding document, and I think it became the author's guiding document as well, to see the pacing of his story. So we had a Skype call to discuss our chapter by chapter notes and high level editing needs. So we talked a lot about developmental, structural, character development. In this case, his character had a lot of quirks that he would sort of randomly mention along the story, but they weren't anchored in the story. So we talked about ways that we could anchor it into her personality, the main character's personality. And in week 1, I basically said, and I think we were halfway through week 1 when I said, okay, we're going to start at the beginning. And I defined the beginning in this case by the first 3 chapters, because that's where all of the main characters had been introduced. And the problem was also, the main problem of the book was introduced. So that's how we decided we would work during week 1 and some of week 2 through the beginning. But I already had told him at this time that in week 2, I would flip over to the end. So I would skip over the whole murky middle part. In this time, I also asked the author to develop a theme brainstorm document. He worked on the story timeline, like a timeline of what the main character is going through. And he also, I asked him for the title brainstorm, and he actually had one in his back pocket. So he just slipped that into our Google Drive folder. And I took about 4 days to get my notes, 4 to 5 days to get all of my notes in the chapter by chapter outline. And we were already actively working on editing, kind of line editing, but also developmental editing, the beginning of his book. By the beginning of week 2, the author is already starting to implement changes to the full. I'm also making suggestions in the full at this point, in weeks 1 and week 2. And I am moving to the end of his manuscript. Each editor will sort of have their own strategic approach, but I think working on the beginning and working on the end is kind of the way to do it. So we jumped straight to the end. I define the end as the all is lost moment through to the end, but I focused very heavily on the all is lost moment. By the end of week 2, the author had already started to join me in addressing some of the stuff some of the suggestions and track changes that I was making, comments in the margins. So we're asking each other questions and comments via email. We're asking smaller questions in the comments portion of the document. We're definitely modifying and reworking our to-do list in our folder. And the author started adding lots of things to do in his to-do list, including adding chapters or making big changes to certain things. So we had another Skype call in week 2, and we started to talk about themes and really reflecting those themes in the title and the blurb. We didn't talk brass tacks in terms of title and blurb, but we definitely talked about themes and things that the author would like to see emerge from his story a little bit better. And we continued to talk about the editing timeline, the amount of time we have left, what we want to see changed or redone, things like that. And and I went back to the beginning to sort of focus on some of the changes that he made while the author is moving to the end of the book to implement the changes that I'm suggesting. So week 3, here the author is now sort of bouncing back and forth between the beginning and the end of the book. And I went through another reread now of the manuscript so that I could really now that I had a strong idea of how the story's beginning and a really strong idea of how it's ending, we're kind of looking in the middle to see if it's being held together. We've already addressed the bookends of this bookshelf, I guess. So the author, though, at this point, and this was what I thought was really interesting about the system, that the author is now identifying the story's plot holes. He was coming to me and saying, like, hey, I noticed that, this thing, that this thing doesn't really fit anymore. Do you think I should do this? Do you think the reader will notice? And I was like, well, if you noticed it, then an avid reader will definitely notice, or a careful reader, and definitely a fan will definitely notice. So I started to notice that the author was coming to me with things that he realized because he has a much more intimate knowledge of his book. And I did a lot more referring to the chapter by chapter outline document that we had, and seeing if we started to correct the issues that we were talking about. A lot of them were pacing issues, and so seeing like where text was still flagging, or if we had now solved those issues, and kind of using the chapter by chapter outline as a checklist to see how we're advancing with editing of the book. By week 4, we are now really, both of us, working on the whole manuscript. I'm kind of reading through it, highlighting things that still stick out at me, new things that are now popping out at me. Those 2 other problems that sprung up because we solved the one problem earlier or later in the book. So I'm kind of going through it for that, and the author is going through that as well. So the author has now effectively taken on the editing hat. And he's less in drafting mode. And the author is still working on rewrites, but I also noticed that the rewrites or the adding of full chapters or full sections as a solution to a problem has now abated, and he's really focusing on language, pacing, noticing repetition. I can't say it's the perfect the perfect system, but I love that the authors really started to take control of his own work. We focused a lot more again on identifying the major themes, trying to like highlight them a bit more. We started talking more about like how we want the theme to reflect in the title and the blurb. And we also talked a lot about the audience, who's likely to read a book and enjoy a book like this, and how that needs to be reflected in the blurb as well. In our case, the voice, his writing voice, really needed to be reflected in the blurb, we felt. So we really started to hone in on how to take this 75,000 word document and highlight all of the best things without sort of giving a rundown of plot points in a blurb. So we really started talking a lot about blurb and title and themes. Week 5, we honed in on the title. I think in week 5, we pretty much decided on a title at this point. We zeroed in on a blurb. We were massaging the end still. We rounded back to the beginning, like I'm saying. So now we're kind of like jumping all around the place, but we're feeling a lot more like the whole meal is sort of coming together. So one of the things I did want to focus on regarding some of the blurb work that we did. The blurb is probably the best example of us working simultaneously or using the watch me work process here. We basically opened up a blank document, if I recall. The author had made a few attempts at writing a blurb, which were fine, but they still weren't completely, we both knew they weren't completely what we wanted out of a blurb. So I kind of, dropped his suggestions down a few lines, and I started to write a few things. And we kind of, I think at the same time we could see, oh, okay, yeah, we really want to pull out this theme and this motif from the novel. We really want to focus on the voice, and we want to make sure that the voice shines through as well. How do we feel about revealing the big problem of the mask? In this story, there was a mask that went missing. How do we reveal this big problem? Do we reveal these problems? So he was kind of watching over my shoulder as I was writing the blurb, which, to be honest, it was a little bit nerve-wracking for me because I don't write in public. But it was kind of fun. And then I put it aside. I said, listen, I gotta go. We were in completely different time zones. And then he took the blurb that I had worked on, and I don't know if it was the watching over my shoulder thing, but I think it kind of spurred on some creative juices for him, but it also gave him kind of a clear direction on the things that he needs to focus on in writing the blurb. And then he came up with a really awesome, a couple of awesome suggestions. So I think he ended up writing 3 blurbs, and then we finally honed it down to one last blurb, which was the one we ended up submitting. That moment of working on the blurb at the same time, having him look over my shoulder as I worked on the blurb. And at this point, I knew the story quite well, probably still not as intimately as he knows it, but quite well. But I think that the watch me work or watch me write approach really helped for him to take ownership of his work, see how his work is perceived and how somebody else might write his same story, and really own his novel. And by this point, I'm also doing a full read through of the manuscript for a lot of small things, pacing, typos. But I'm sort of, as the editor, I'm sort of like moving out of this process, and the author is kind of taken control, which is ideal and really what I think we want for indie authors to understand in this process. So by week 6 and 7, the author pretty much took over. He would sometimes write to me or ask me a question. What do I think of this? But by this point, he was fully empowered to make decisions for his book completely on his own. We had addressed pretty much everything that he needed to know. And so he was pretty much on his own by the time we submitted it to the judges. So that's kind of my run through. I hope it wasn't too long, and I hope that you pulled some ideas out of this. And if you have any ways to sort of trim this process or streamline it, please let me know. I would love to hear about them. But it definitely, even though the first 2 weeks of the editing process were overwhelming and kind of stressful, they had kind of abated by weeks 3 through 5, and definitely 6 and 7. So I'm hopeful that this method might be helpful for you. If you have any questions, you can always email them to me at cynthia@livinginsin.com. That's the easy to remember version. You can also get me through Gmail, cynthiatluna@gmail.com.